Well, good morning and God bless you and welcome to the Torah portion today. Wonderful to be with you on this wonderful Saturday morning. And from wherever you are in Australia, you're so welcome. We've got people starting to pile into the room, which is lovely. And I want to say a special hello to a couple of people. First of all, Jim Carlill and Maxine from up in Budrum. They're going to be sharing today on the portion. Because it is a special portion. And my great old friend Steve Stuttle joining us from Yamba. Pastor Steve, lovely to have you here today. So, I see my old mate Al there. We didn't talk much this week, Al, because we were away on camp. Didn't have much reception where I was. All right, well, and most of us, by the way, have just come back from a family camp and we sort of celebrated the week of Passover or Feast of Unleavened Bread down by a beautiful Lake Mugra. Wow, what a wonderful week that was, sitting next to some of you and just chatting and chewing the cud and particularly getting around the scriptures. Golly, I'm amazed by our children. Our children know their scriptures because they're usually on the portion. I see several of you, the kids on the portion right now, coming into the Word of God and getting into it from the age of 5. It's fantastic. All right, well, let me just share. Today is a special portion. It's actually not part of the portion cycle per se. We're still on the 7th day of the Feast of Unleavened Bread. This is the last day. So for all you who have been eating your unleavened bread, this is the last day. You're probably saying, yippee, we're going to have some bread tonight, you know. So, but we certainly have been honoring that. It's also day 6 of the Omer count. Why do we do that? Well, the scripture actually commands it, that we count from the day, what we would call the resurrection day, which was last Monday, really, from Sunday night through to Monday night. And it's counted through all the way to the 50th day, of course, which is Pentecost. And so God has this schedule of timing. He is so precise. And so he actually commands us to count. Today is that day. Why don't we just do that? I'll pray it through. And we'll do that count today. It's day 6, right? Let's do it together. Blessed are you, Lord our God, King of the universe, who sanctifies us with the commandment to count the Omer. And today, Lord, we count that it is week 1, day 6. Amen. All right, we're 6 days out of 50 on the way to Pentecost, in other words. All right, let me just share my screen because it is a special portion. This is how you'll get to the page today. This is your members lounge for those who obviously all of your members, and you'll go down here and you'll find today this week's Torah portion, and it will come up to Chol Hamo'ed Pesach. It's a special term. It's an intermediate non-holy day of this biblical festival, but it happens to fall today on the Shabbat. And so we have a special page done up for that, with the usual readings for that. And of course, you can go down here. And Dean has kindly placed on here a lovely AI-generated Passover message here. If you would like to have a look at that, it's 12 minutes long. It's done by AI, but they're pretty good. They're pretty good, those ones. So it's a special day today. Let's just talk briefly about it before I unleash Jim. He's going to be talking, of course, Jim and Maxine are from the International Christian Embassy for Jerusalem and on the board and have spent many years living in Israel. And Jim is a civil engineer, and of course, he's done a lot of, I want to say, archaeological type work. He's very interested in places and what they mean and the stones and the history and the roots that the children of Israel took out of Egypt, and he's studied that and been to those places. So we're looking forward to that, Jim. But this day is a special day. It's a Shabbat that falls within the Feast of Unleavened Bread. And so it is, of course, the Feast of Unleavened Bread goes for 7 days. We have Passover on the 14th day of Aviv. On the 15th day of Aviv started the Feast of Unleavened Bread through to the 21st day of Aviv. Aviv is the name, the biblical name of the first month of the year. This is God's calendar we're talking about here. For those who don't know yet, in Israel today, they call it Nisan, which the month Nisan, which is a Babylonian term that has been applied, and it's sort of stuck. I don't know about you, but I'd prefer to use the name that God said, this name is the name of the first month. Aviv, it means the ripening of the barley, and sure enough, the barley ripens in the month of Aviv, and so God, through his beautiful lunar calendar, has made it so that the months all line up, bang, bang, bang. The new moon kicks off the months, and so we have the dates of all of these special festivals locked in and aligned to the biblical calendar. Interestingly enough, I was with a couple of lovely ladies looking out over the sunset over at Lake Mulgara. And as the sun was going down, I turned to the ladies, I said, do you realize this is the end of the day of the resurrection, the 16th of Aviv? And, we just stood there and amazed at the glory of God as that sunset went down over those magnificent mountains. You're looking up into the ranges there back of Brisbane, those beautiful ranges that go up into Warwick and Cunningham's Gap and all that, so Toowoomba. And so we really like to keep those dates because God says these are my festivals. Sometimes people think they're Jewish festivals, but the Lord made it very clear in Leviticus chapter 23, these are not Jewish festivals, these are my festivals. And the Jewish people have been fantastic, wonderful, assigned custodians of the festivals, but they speak and always point to our Lord Jesus. So they're for the whole world. They are for the whole world because Jesus is the Savior of the world, isn't he? For his people and the Gentiles as well. All right, so this is the day that traditionally the children of Israel, the 7th day after leaving Egypt, came to the Red Sea and they crossed the Red Sea. This is the day. It's a special day. It's a very holy, they say it's a holy day, a special high Shabbat. And so it's a day no work is done. This is a day we're still eating unleavened bread. And the children of Israel, think about it, are still being pursued by the Egyptians. So they've escaped Egypt, but Egypt hasn't escaped them, as it were. The Pharaoh's chasing them down, and they're about to cross the Red Sea, but there's the sea. It's there in front of them. And Moses lifts up his staff, and the sea parts, and they cross over that amazing Red Sea, and then the sea closes back in on the Egyptians, and that's the end of the influence of the Egyptians, per se, at that point. And that's the day that they were really set free and became a nation now dedicated to God, because they then go on to Mount Sinai and receive the Torah and make commitments to God, and he becomes their husband, if you like, and the nation of Israel becomes his bride, and the Torah is given, the great ketubah, the great betrothal document for the children of Israel. And they're on their way to the land that God promised them way back with Abraham. And so this is the message today. We're coming to the end of this time here, but it also speaks for us today of our deliverance. Jesus came, he died on Passover, he was in the tomb on the 15th day of Aviv, on the 14th he died, on the 15th he was in the tomb, on the 16th he was resurrected, and then he came back in his resurrected body, and he spent time with his disciples and multitudes of people. But it speaks to us of immersion, our decision to go beyond believing in Jesus to now following him as a disciple, getting ourselves completely, not just believing in Jesus now, but still influenced by the world. But we make a decision that we're going to obey God, follow Jesus, and we're going to become his disciple. There's a difference between a believer and a disciple. And so this great day, today, is the day that in a way commemorates baptism, immersion, our decision to become a disciple and move forward from here and embrace God in our obedience to him and his word. And so that's what a very special meaning for today. But I'm not going to hog today because this is not about that. I just wanted to set the scene as for why this is a bit of a break from our normal Torah portion. So I'm going to pass over now to Jim from International Christian Embassy of Jerusalem. And we are absolutely delighted to have you here, Jim. Jim's got a very lovely PowerPoint presentation. He's going to talk us through that. I'm thoroughly looking forward to this. So, Jim, I'm going to pass over to you right now.
Okay. Okay. Can you see all? Am I muted here or not?
No, you're all good, Jim.
I'm all good. Okay. Well, thank you for that introduction very much, Pastor Greg. And as you said, this is a time when we should be reading a Torah portion in Leviticus, and also it's a time of Pesach. But today, this presentation today has really nothing to do with those two topics. I will be, though, talking about the life of Abraham, as Abraham is the beginning of the redemptive story, and he's a very important man in our scriptures. And so some of the information I'll share today will be from Dr. Rolf Wilson in his Abraham Bible Study series. He's a very knowledgeable man, but we're not talking about Abraham today. And for a start, the first question is, from where did Abraham come? Did he come from southern Mesopotamia? The Bible says that he came from the of the Chaldeans or the Chaldees. An ancient Sumerian city called was excavated in lower Mesopotamia by Sir Leonard Woolley in 1824. And since then, that city has been identified as the biblical of the Chaldeans. However, the Chaldeans did not come into this area until about 1,000 years after Abraham, and they did not conquer the area until about another 300 years, a long time after Genesis was written. Incidentally, just means city, like in the Hebrew word for Ir, it means city. For those who've been to Jerusalem, who've been to the city of David, it's called Ir David. Ir is the same word, just means city. So this then raises the question, why in Genesis is this city called of Chaldeans, if such a historical situation did not exist for over 1,300 years after Abraham and 800 years after Moses? One possible explanation is that the reference to Chaldeans was added later on. Another one is, of course, that it was not the city in southern Mesopotamia where he came from. Perhaps he came from northern Mesopotamia. And there are good and very good reasons for the biblical of the Chaldees to be located in northern Mesopotamia. But this is not the time to discuss it in full detail, but suffice to say that both Jewish historian Josephus and one of the most famous Jewish scholars, Maimonides, he lived about in the 1100s, both believe that the biblical city of was in northern Mesopotamia. And some further evidence for northern is that is in southern Mesopotamia is never called of the Chaldeans in hundreds of references in cuneiform texts, such as the Alba tablet, and that's the pre-patriarchal civilization, northern Syria. But it does refer to an in Haran. And there is additional evidence for a northern from a Muslim source, which is quite later on, of course, but it is a source. A city quite close to Haran, previously called Hia, but now called Edessa, was conquered by the Muslims in 638 and was a special city for them because an ancient local legend claimed that Abraham to them, was born in that city called Hia. So Hia is the city of choice of Abraham's birth of a fellow called Bill Shegel. And he's an associate professor in Jerusalem and is the author of the of a book called the Satellite Bible Atlas. And this map you're looking at now, that actually comes from his book, and it's a great buy if you're interested in such things. Most of the opinion that Abraham, that he came from northern Mesopotamia, I certainly lean in that direction, because a city not far from Haran, and it did not come from the Sumerian city in the southern Mesopotamia. A city he may have come from up there in northern Mesopotamia is, it could be Hurian, could be Urfa, or Urkesh. They've all got the in front of them. It's interesting that the leader of Urkesh, about the time of Abraham, was a man called Teru. Could that leader be Abraham's father, Terah? It sounds very similar. So this slide shows that a northern location is considered by others as a possible alternative location of Abraham's city of origin. So he's only got dotted lines going up leading away from the southern city. However, no matter from which Abraham came, both cities were as bad as each other in the worship of many gods, the moon god in particular. And this was a pagan culture in which Abraham grew up. We can read in the scriptures that long ago your forefathers, including Terah, the father of Abraham, and Nahor, lived beyond the river and worshipped other gods. So the moon god was called many names, including the exalted Lord and the crown of heaven and earth. But his real name was Nanna in southern Mesopotamia, and it's called Sin in northern Mesopotamia. And this moon god, Sin or Nanna, was the head of all gods. The worship of the moon god was over a wide area, and it continued for a long time. Note that the god warns the Israelites against the worshipping the moon, as well as other heavenly bodies. He says in Deuteronomy, as we can read, if any man has bowed down to the sun or moon, stone that person to death. And there is strong evidence too that Allah, the god of Islam, is one and the same moon god of ancient times, having been chosen by Muhammad as the greatest god of all the other gods of Arabia. And there are over 300 gods in Arabia at the time of Muhammad. Now it was to be their only god. Note that the moon god symbol in Mesopotamia was to be their, which is shown upper left in the photo. I think you can just see it there. It's in upper left in the photograph. And it's the same symbol displayed on mosques and flags of Islamic countries, like the one for Pakistan there, with the moon and a star in the middle. It's just hang on for a minute, okay. Well, there's a black line across the top of here. You can't quite see the top of that monument with the crescent moon in it.
Yeah, you can. You
can,
Jim.
Can see it.
We can see it. Are you saying?
Okay, good.
Are you saying that this crescent and the star in it dates way back to Abraham's time?
In Mesopotamia time, yeah. That's the plaque come from Mesopotamia.
Yeah, that's amazing, isn't it? Like you can see the correlation there. People, if you want to ask Jim a question, just hit your response react bar and lift up your hand now, and Jim can answer your questions.
Yeah, that's if I see it. I'll try.
We'll prompt you if we don't.
Okay, good. Okay. Also, it's of interest, in Jericho, it calls itself the City of Moon, the City of the Moon. And if you go to Jericho, right in the center of Jericho, they've got a big monument there, and they declare themselves, we are the City of the Moon. And Jericho is very much like the Hebrew word for moon anyway. So there's some connection there, I think. So now we're moving on to Haran. At a time not recorded in Scripture, Terah and his wife set out from to Canaan. But they stopped at Haran, where Terah decided to settle for a reason, and again, that's not recorded in Scripture. He may become ill or found good grazing, we don't know, but he stayed and died in Haran. And Haran is in northern Mesopotamia, about 40 kilometers from Urfa, and is a possible location of the of the Chaldees. Note that the Hebrew words for Haran in the city and Abraham's brother and father of Lot is also Haran. They're not the same word. In Haran, the city, the H in English is the Hebrew letter Het, and the H of Haran, Lot's father, is a Hebrew letter Hey. So they are two different words, but in English they sound exactly the same, actually. At the time Abraham left for Canaan, Mesopotamia, and the adjacent areas were in a fluid political situation. The Sumerian dynasty in southern Mesopotamia had fallen apart, and there was no dominant nation group. The nation groups in the area may be summarized as follows: approximate only, as the area was in a fluid state. And there they are: the Elamites to the southeast, Sumerians to the south, Akkadians to the middle, and Hurians, or later called Mitanni, to the north, and the Hittites were further north. The Hurians were an ethnic group in the Mesopotamia area and were scattered over a large area. The area they actually controlled was around Haran in a city called Nuzi, further to the south and a little bit to the east of the Tigris River. And the Hurian town of Nuzi is now called Kirkuk in northern Iraq. Thousands of clay tablets had been discovered around 1930, detailing business transactions and many of their social customs. I'll be referencing some of these social customs during this presentation, which will provide evidence that Abraham was strongly influenced by the culture of the Hurrians. This is also further evidence that he came from northern Mesopotamia, and possibly he was a Hurrian. The date that Abraham set out to Canaan is disputed, as are all dates beyond, say, 1500 BCE. However, general agreement is that it was between 2100 and 1800. However, there's no definite proof of the actual date or any date that scholars may put forward. I've assumed, though, that Abraham was born in 1998 BCE and left Haran 75 years later. Abraham owns cattle and sheep and was a semi-nomad, moving around as politics or a suitable grazing required. In Genesis and Hebrews, it says that he, Isaac and Jacob, lived in tents, and so his life reminds us of life's temporary nature, dependence and trust in God, and belief in promises to come. I'll read this. The Lord said to Abram, leave your country, your people, and your father's household, and go to the land I will show you. It is clear that God wanted Abraham to cut all ties with his past, from his country, from his people, and from his family. And that would have been a big deal back in those times. And probably because the country was totally pagan, and all his relatives would have worshipped pagan gods, as did everybody around there. Even the names of his relatives, Laban, Sarah, and Milcah, contain elements that reveal their allegiance to the moon god. Sarah comes from the word Saratu, meaning queen, the name for a female partner of the moon god Sin. And Milcah, his sister-in-law, is the same name as the goddess Malkuta, his daughter of Sin. And Laban, Rebecca's brother, means white or white one. It's the same word in Hebrew, Laban. And Laban means for them, and Laban was a poetic name of the full moon. Also of interest is that Terah is similar to the Hebrew word for moon, Yareh, and even the NIV notes so that Terah means moon worshipper. Throughout the Bible, God separates people. The calling of Abraham is the first instance of God separating his chosen people from pagan unrighteousness. Another interesting point relates to Sarah. Remember that Sarah is also a part of the pagan moon worship culture, as we see in her name, and she was barren. God may have caused this barrenness to further separate his people from the pagan bloodline. The birth of her son Isaac was a supernatural event and occurred only after God's direct intervention. Obviously, God had already had already blessed Abraham. Jewish commentary says that in Genesis, Chol 5, it says the people they had acquired in Haran, these people had become believers of the one true God, because the Hebrew word translated in English as people is in fact nefeshim, meaning souls. It's interesting that Abraham was 75 years old at this time and Sarah was 65 years. Yet this did not deter him from following God. He was obedient. His total faith was now in the God who had called him. In Genesis 14:13, Abraham is called an Ivri, and from the Hebrew root, from the other side. This literally means from the other side of the river Euphrates. Another little deeper meaning could be that he is now righteous in God's eyes. The other side stands for an unrighteous pagan land from where he was called out. Note that the Hebrew word for language Hebrew is Ivrit to this day. That's what it's called. So again, this map is from this William Siegel's book. When he gets to Canaan, what is the situation? Canaan was not a kingdom. It did not represent a nation or a dominant group of people, but a conglomeration of different people or tribes who had migrated there, and generally they were called Canaanites. When Abraham entered Canaan, he may have come through the ancient city, which was later called Dan, and which existed before the time of Abraham. And some of you folk might have seen this gate. I reckon it's one of the best sites in the whole of Israel. The gate, and to think that Abraham might have been there 4,000 years ago. The gate and mud bricks were excavated in the 1960s, and these mud walls are over 4,000 years old and may have seen Abraham and his entourage. The original opening can be seen larger than the present-day timber frame opening. You can see that it's arched around the timber frame. His first step is Shechem. His first stop in Canaan was Shechem, which is in a very well-watered and desirable valley in Israel, abounding with springs. I've heard there are over 20 springs in and around Shechem. For him to move in there unopposed is mere testimony to the fact that he must have had quite a large group of people with him. God spoke to him in Shechem, reaffirming his promises, and Abraham built an altar there. A reason why God spoke to Abraham
how many people do you think were with him on that entourage? Have you got a thought on that?
Not a single thought, but it all depends. When they said he left the Haran with a lot of souls, he'd obviously gathered a lot around him, and all depends how long he'd been there, how many sheep and cattle he had, and shepherds. I really no thoughts at all. Sorry.
Well, we know for a fact. Well, 10 years later, when he was the dispute between Lot and
Yes.
Abram for the land, he was able to furnish an army of 318 men. Correct. From his own. So it's, like if they all got wives and children, that's a fair gathering, isn't
it? Absolutely. And not only that, they weren't shepherds; they were an army. As I'll talk about that later on.
Right.
Okay, so when he built an altar there in Shechem. The reason why God spoke to him there in this new land is that God wished to affirm that he was the God over all his creation and not bounded by borders. The culture of the day was that gods were territorial, and when someone left an area and went into a new area, they were then under the authority of the gods of the new area. For example, the gods of Mesopotamia were different to the gods of Canaan and different to the gods of Egypt. But at Shechem, Abraham acknowledged God's sovereignty over all territories and all countries by building an altar to him within the territory of the Canaanite gods, something unique in those times. The next stop was between Bethel and Ai, where he built another altar. These altars were not for sacrifice, but to acknowledge God, a declaration to the Canaanites that there is one God above all gods. From the altar shown, which is on a hill between the little altar there. It's on a hill between Ai and Bethel. It's possible to see Ai down the hill to the east, currently being excavated. You see the photo there, and Bethel is to the west. And further to the east of the Dead Sea in Jordan, it can be seen on a clear day. And Jerusalem can also be seen about 16 kilometers to the south. A great place for Abraham to go and to build an altar. Today, the main north-south road through the center of Israel, Road 60, that passes between Ai and Bethel, and more or less follows the ancient road called the Way of the Patriarchs. By the way, that altar you see there was not from Abraham. A friend and I built it in 2014 because I've traveled around Israel. I've never come across a small altar. There are many big altars there, but those little ones. So I determined that I wanted to build a small one, and what better place to build an altar was where Abraham would have done it, right on this little ridge between Ai and Bethel. Maybe it's still there today. I don't know. But if you go up in that part of the world, you can have a look. Abraham journeyed, going on toward the south, and there was a famine in the land, and Abraham went down into Egypt to sojourn there, for the famine was grievous in the land. That's from Genesis 12. In these verses, it is written that Abraham went to the Negev and then to Egypt because of a severe famine. It takes only seconds to read these lines, but this trip is remarkable for a number of reasons. There is a lot of desert from, say, Beersheba to the Nile Delta. However, the Bible apparently takes for granted that it was relatively safe to travel, excuse me, over 500 kilometers to Egypt, with friendly towns providing food and water for quite a large caravan of people. The archaeologist Nelson Gluck, who studied Jordan, the Negev, and Sinai in the first half of the 1900s, found that the Negev was empty of settled areas for about 1,000 years before Abraham. Then there was about 300 years of settlement during the time of the patriarchs, and after that, these areas became empty again, and empty of settlements for hundreds of years. During the time when there was no settlements, these areas were dominated by marauding, nomadic desert tribes who fiercely defended their water sources. So at this time, systems which enabled water to be stored where wells were not possible had not been invented. They were not common for another 600 or 700 years in these areas. Water had to come from wells or isolated springs, all of which were jealously guarded by a desert tribe. There was virtually no running water in these areas. So no foreigner and no foreigners in their right mind would travel this route unless accompanied by an army or equivalent. The desert tribes were the undisputed lords of the southern Negev and Sinai. So it is one of those amazing examples of the timing of God that Abraham and the patriarchs appeared on the scene during this brief period when the area was settled and more or less safe to travel down to Egypt with a large caravan of people and flocks. They went down there to live in Egypt, it says there. Now, the root word for English, of the English to live is gur, G-U-R, to sojourn, as to be a stranger. Even though it was relatively safe during this period to travel to Egypt, his treatment was still at the whim of the king or warlord of the area in Egypt in which he finally settled. Abraham would have no civil or legal rights, and he would be fully dependent on the hospitality of his hosts. Abraham had every justification to feel just a little bit afraid and apprehensive. Even today, in some countries, including Northern Africa, tribal warlords are in control of some areas and will kill anyone they choose to. However, Abraham faced a problem that many travelers or refugees may not face. He had a beautiful wife who may be abducted, and if so, he, Abraham, would be killed. So he comes up with a plan. You may think Abraham is a bit of a cad and a coward, but maybe not so. I'll read the scriptures there. I know what a beautiful woman you are. When the Egyptians see you, they will say, this is his wife. Then they will kill me, but will let you live. So you are my sister. Say you are my sister, so that I'll be treated well for your sake, and my life will be spared because of you. So if Abraham had stayed in Negev, he may have faced death from starvation. But by coming to Egypt, he foresaw that both he and Sarah would live if he was willing to say that she was his sister. So the practicalities ruled. But is Abraham telling a lie, a half-truth, or the whole truth when he said, she is my sister? For a start, it's at least a half-truth because she is his half-sister. Like it says in Genesis 20, besides, she really is my sister, the daughter of my father, although not of my mother, and she became my wife. But there is more. Remember the Hurians I spoke about? Amongst the information the Nuzi clay tablets tell about their customs, they tell how a man could formally adopt his wife as a sister. He could adopt his wife as a sister. By doing this, he would be giving her a status even higher than a wife and entitling her to privileges not ordinarily available to a wife. If Abraham had legally adopted his wife as his sister in Haran, and it's quite possible because he knew that he was going to travel through unknown and potentially dangerous tribal territory, Sarah would have been a legal sister according to Hurian culture, as well as his wife, before they left Haran. So he may well have been telling the whole truth. But then Pharaoh found out that Sarah was in fact Abraham's wife. And the scriptures there, but the Lord inflicted serious diseases on Pharaoh and his household because of Abraham's wife Sarah. And he said, why didn't you tell me she was your wife? And then he said, take her and go. The question is, what happened between verses 17 and 18? And how did Pharaoh know that Sarah was Abraham's wife? And when he found out, why didn't he kill Abraham? Remember that after the dispersion of all of Noah's descendants at the time of Babel, two of Ham's sons, Mitzrayim and Put, went to Egypt. By the way, the Hebrew word for Egypt is Mitzrayim. Therefore, the Egyptians were descendants of Ham. Although we're not told how long Ham lived, we are told that he was younger than Shem, and Shem lived as long as Abraham, but well and truly into Abraham's life. So it could be that after Babel, Ham traveled and settled with his sons in what is now Egypt and retired there. And as one of the patriarchs of all mankind, he would have been shown great respect from everyone, including Pharaoh. In even Psalm 105 and elsewhere, Egypt is called the land of Ham. Therefore, it could have been Ham who recognized Abraham as a man of God, who told Pharaoh all about him. That, of course, is pure speculation, but I think it's a nice story of how Pharaoh found out about Abraham.
Hey, Jim, can we just pause there for a couple of seconds? Because you've just raised a couple of very, very interesting points. I don't know if anyone else found those as interesting as me. First of all, the context of the Hurians.
Yep.
Doesn't that bring an amazing aspect to Abraham referring to his wife as his sister? I mean, he was his half-sister, but adopting, I was just trying to get my head around the fact that a woman could be adopted as a person's sister. And if that's his background and culture, then, and it was normal and natural, then of course he's not in any way lying. But you'd have to know you'd have to know that. I mean, that is new information to me. And you know, I've studied the peoples of that time, but that's a phenomenal point of view. Mm-hmm. Do you have any in your notes there, any references to that at all?
Go to the internet. You'll find heaps about the Hurians. You'll find heaps about Nuzi tablets.
Yeah.
And
And those sort of
Yeah,
things
well,
about adoption of sisters, yeah.
yeah, it's all there, and all these other things I've yet to talk about.
Yeah,
It's all spelled out by many sources in the internet. It's not just one
incredible.
person. It is
Incredible.
incredible.
Yeah, it is incredible. And the second thing I think that's just struck me, of course, is because we talk about here on the portion the fact that Shem was still alive and
Yeah,
venerated and revered by people and was, the Jewish belief is that Melchizedek was
yeah,
Shem, who was
yes,
in Salem at the time, which is
yes,
Jerusalem
that's right.
today.
Yeah,
And that confrontational meeting, not confrontation, but meeting between Melchizedek and Abraham and his veneration, his reverence for Melchizedek was the fact that
yeah,
he's talking to one of the sons of Noah. I had never
correct.
thought about the fact that, of course, Ham was probably still alive and
Yes, yeah,
down in
because he was
Egypt.
younger than Shem. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know why it never dawned on me, but the fact is that obviously Japheth is alive somewhere as well. But down in Egypt, yes.
Yeah.
I mean, it's possible that the Ham, the son of Noah, was still alive in Egypt. I don't know if anyone else was amazed by that as I was, because it explains, potentially some intervention there by the great man
Yeah,
over his great, whatever,
yeah,
grandson or
sure.
nephew at least. Yeah.
And those three verses I read, they're 17, 18, and 19, they're consecutive verses. So Pharaoh found out all of a sudden, I think, whoops, who have I got here?
Yeah, right. Yeah,
And
brilliant.
anyway, the Hurians are amazing people. If you look up the internet and find out about them, they are quite amazing and what they did. Okay. Um, number 19. So anyway, Abraham became even wealthier. Among the gifts showered on Abraham were camels. An interesting bit of information about camels is for a long time, critics of the Bible used to say that camels were not domesticated in Abraham's time. Therefore, the Bible cannot be relied upon. However, in more recent times, many references regarding the use of camels have been found in a number of clay tablets written before Abraham's time. Again, time and the continual uncovering of ancient information has proven the biblical record. In due course, Abraham and Sarah, along with Lot and their acquired wealth, returned to the former camp between Bethel and Ai. Owing to a conflict between the herdsmen of Lot and Abraham suggested that they part company. Lot by now knew the country, and he chose what he thought would be the easier life in the Jordan Valley. So where, in fact, did Lot go? The following is a very brief discussion of the location of Sodom. It has been commonly assumed and shown in virtually every Bible map that Sodom was situated at the southern end of the Dead Sea. But there is now a lot of convincing evidence to suggest it is at the northern end of the Dead Sea, opposite Jericho. The following is only a small part of that evidence. In fact, I don't think there is any evidence it was in the southern part of the Dead Sea. In Genesis, it recorded what Lot saw as he looked to the east from Ai. Note the location of Ai on the map. It's just above the top of the Dead Sea. And I'll read this is what was said. Lot looked around and saw that the whole plain of the Jordan towards Zoar was well watered, like the land of Egypt. So Lot chose for himself the whole plain of the Jordan and set out towards the east. It's towards the east. The English translation, the whole plain, in the above verses, bears little resemblance to the Hebrew. The Hebrew translated as plain is, in fact, kikar, and kikar means something round or oval shaped. In fact, in Israel today, the intersection of roads, big square in the middle or round, that's called a kikar. The word travels on. And they, in this, sorry, and due east of Ai and Bethel, where Abraham and Lot were when they discussed Lot's separation, is a roundish area either side of the Jordan River, about 25 kilometers in diameter, immediately north of the Dead Sea, and it's partially surrounded by hills. This area is very well watered and very fertile and could well be described as a kikar. In this area are the ruins of 5 cities on the east side of the Jordan River. One, an enormous city, now known as Tel El Hammam, which includes the remains of its city gates. The two, where are we? Oh, sorry, that's got to go back. Where are we? Yes. And in Genesis it says, the 2 angels arrived in Sodom in the evening, and Lot was sitting in the gateway of the city. When he saw them, he got up to meet them and bowed down with his face to the ground. Now, the walls around this city, this Tel El Hammam, were 5 meters wide and up to 15 meters high, and very large and impressive gate foundations. This photo is an interpretation of the gates of Tel El Hammam, where Lot would have been sitting when the angels came to see him. And this sketch is by biblical archaeological artist called Leon Rittmeyer, who knows a lot about Israel and things, and done a lot of paintings. Note, in this Kikar area, there are today the remains of 5 cities and many villages, and Tel El Hammam is by far the largest one. I also am of the opinion that this city is most likely the biblical Sodom. And even the NIV Study Bible agrees that Sodom could be located in this place north of the Dead Sea. They also admit that the word plain that they've translated is in fact round and circular. So even the NIV is moving in that direction. According to legend, the photo, moving into Haran, the photo is of the ancient oak near Haran is of Abraham's tree, which is probably not, but that's what the legend is. And at a much later date, however, the Roman Emperor Hadrian sold Jewish slaves in the vicinity of this tree after the failed Bar Kokhba revolt in 135 CE. And reportedly, 135,000 slaves were sold here. So Israel lost very badly in that war. But soon, in Genesis chapter 14, Abraham has a chance to prove that he is certainly not a wimp, a cad, or a coward when the 4 kings of the east came to Canaan and made war against the 5 kings in the valley of the Salt, that's the Dead Sea area, and carried off Lot and his family. Before we look at these kings from the east, consider Lot. Lot had been in the land for less than 10 years in Genesis 16:3, and the king of Elam had been taxing 5 kings of the plains for 12 years. So Lot went in to live amongst the Sodomites, knowing that he would have to pay taxes to Elam, as well as that he was a ger, he was an alien, and the immoral nature of the people, and the nature of the climate, extremely hot. You know, it's 400 meters below sea level. Those that have been to the Dead Sea know that it's pretty hot down there in that part of the world. It seemed as if he was willing to put up with these conditions so he could embrace the pleasures and lifestyle of Sodom. Now back to the kings of the east. The 4 kings from the east are from Mesopotamia, the area from which Abraham had cut all ties 10 years before. The leader, Kedorlaomer, is from Elam, to the east of the Tigris, and at that time was dominant over 2 kingdoms in southern Mesopotamia, Shinar and Elasar. I'll read that this time. Amraphel, king of Shinar, Arioch, king of Elasar, Kedorlaomer, king of Elam, and Tidal, king of Goim, went to war against the 5 kings around the Dead Sea. For 12 years, they had been subject to Kedorlaomer, but in the 13th year, they rebelled. Now, another of the kings, the king of the Goim, is interesting. Goim means nations or other people. And so at that time, it appears that this king was not the leader of one nation. It's been suggested that he was a Hittite, and his troops were mercenaries from the countries round about. Apparently, the Hittites used mercenaries from other countries. One of the kings, Arioch, the king of Elasar, has been identified by some at least as a Hurian. Remember, nothing is ever completely agreed by everybody concerning dates, boundaries, and geographies of these ancient times. However, what the kings did, though, is very interesting. These kings, first of all, traveled down the east side of the Jordan River on what is called the King's Highway, defeating 6 nation groups detailed in Genesis 14, before advancing further south to El Paran, or Etzion-Geber, as it's shown there. Note that one group they defeated was El Paran, the biblical city of Etzion-Geber, a port at the head of the Red Sea, which you can't see, by the way. It's just at the underneath the bottom of the map. It's now called Aqaba in Jordan, for those who've been there, and was a site of metal processing furnaces. They probably went to El Paran, as this city was a center of a metal refining industry, and the kings would have wanted to get copper and iron, as these metals were essential in the manufacture of weapons. Later, by the time of Solomon, Etzion-Geber, as it was then called, had the biggest ore smelter in the world, and some remains are still visible. Now, on the way home, with all their booty, including copper and iron from Etzion-Geber, these kings from the east headed north and conquered the 5 kings around the Dead Sea, Sodom, Gomorrah, and 3 others, and also carried off Lot and his family. When Abraham hears about this, he pursues them as far as Dan, about 200 kilometers north of Hebron. Abraham takes with him, as you said, Greg, 318 trained men. The Hebrew word for trained men is kanik, meaning slaves or servants, whose main function is to provide military assistance. They are not just shepherds who grabbed a spear, and this does give some indication of the size of Abraham's tribe at this time and his wealth, now having his own mini army. How was it that Abraham, with a relatively small fighting force of 318, could so easily defeat the 4 kings with their big armies on their way home? We're not told, but my guess is that the fighting force of the northern kingdoms were probably hurrying home ahead of the caravan of booty, as all the major tribes and kingdoms along the way had been defeated, and they expected no opposition. The large caravan of camels and donkeys carrying all the booty from the defeated cities, as well as the copper and iron from Etzion-Geber, would have been slowly making its way home, trailing a long way behind the fighting forces, feeling completely safe. If so, it would have been relatively easy for Abraham to defeat the probably under-defended caravan and the booty. Apart from rescuing Lot, this pursuit and defeat of the Mesopotamian kings by Abraham proved that he really had broken all ties from his former country. There was now no returning to Mesopotamia. Remember God's instructions to Abraham in Haran? Leave your country, your people, and your father's household, and go to the land I'll show you. On the way back to Hebron from Dan, Abraham is passing Jerusalem. He's met by 2 kings, the king of Sodom and Melchizedek. He's a righteous king, the king of Salem. He's met in the valley of Shaveh, or the King's Valley, which is the Kidron Valley on the east side of Jerusalem. Whoops, sorry. Abraham's treatment of the 2 kings is interesting. From the king of Salem, he accepts hospitality, bread and wine, and goes and gives to the king 1/10 of everything he had acquired from attacking the 4 kings. It's quite a generous donation, and thus acknowledging the kingship of Melchizedek. And this, I think, is also the first mention of bread and wine in the Bible. And the king of Salem, Melchizedek, also tells Abraham that it was, in fact, God who delivered the kings into his hands. So it just wasn't his team and his 318 fighting force, but God did it for him. But Abraham accepts nothing from the king of Sodom and wants to do nothing with him. Now, a point regarding Eliezer, Abraham's servant. In the covenant between God and Abraham, God refers to Abraham's offspring as numerous as the stars. This must have been good news both to him and Sarah, because up till now, their inheritor was Eliezer. Did you ever wonder why Eliezer, a servant, should be considered the heir of Abraham's estate? He says that. Abraham said, "A sovereign Lord, I remain childless, and one will inherit my state, is Eliezer of Damascus." Oh, whoops. Oh, yeah. Sorry. It was a Hurian custom that if a couple was childless, they could adopt any man they chose or even a slave. That person was then obliged to care for them in old age, to weep over them when they died, and then to bury them. He would then inherit whatever property there was, and this appears to be the case with Eliezer, a servant of Abraham.
Would this be
Let's consider Hagar.
Do you think here's another one of these Hurian customs that we're not aware of, but which sort of inform this interesting thought as Eliezer being his heir? Is Eliezer the servant that Abram sends to get a wife for his son Isaac? Is that explicitly said that in the scripture?
Well, I think so. I think it's Eliezer, his servant.
So yeah. It makes more sense here now that this this man Eliezer was an adopted heir.
Yes.
Now looking after the family in a way, isn't it? So
yeah.
Because this isn't a
they're getting a bit old at this point in time.
Exactly. That's great.
And it could be too that some of these customs of the Hurians were also other people also use some of them as well, which I don't know, but they could be. But these, in fact, are what I'm saying now. They are Hurian customs.
A couple of thoughts here, Jim. Just my mind is going, and please, anybody who would like to ask questions for Jim, this is your chance. But right at the beginning, you said Ur of the Chaldees, which I've always thought was down in the south, as most of the maps suggest. And then
they all say that
they walk up to Haran, and then from there he shoots out towards Israel or Canaan.
Yeah.
Were the Hurians anywhere near the southern Ur?
No.
So that was the different. I can't remember the name of the ones you put up there, but so the Hurians were only up the top.
In the middle and the top.
Yeah, right. Okay.
They covered, what I've read, they were very populous, and they covered a big area rather than just sort of one chunk, so to speak. And but they certainly were at the top around all the Urs we were talking about, Kesh, here, up there, as well as the Nuzi tablets. And Nuzi were the city Nuzi was a bit south and a bit to the east of the Tigris, but still certainly in the upper 1/3 of the Mesopotamia.
Yeah, it's fantastic to even think this. It sort of spreads a bit of context, doesn't it, on Abraham and some of the things he did. Yeah, it's great.
Yeah. Okay, so now let's carry on about the Hurians and look at Hagar. And the offering of Hagar to Abraham by Sarah was that time normal under certain circumstances. But we might ask, was it immoral? For a start, having a male heir was incredibly important in their culture, and even more so to Abraham and Sarah, as God had told them they would have a multitude of offspring. How could that be without first giving birth to a son? The Hurian Nuzi tablets speak about the problem when a wife is barren. They explain that a barren wife is required to provide a handmaiden for her husband to bear a child, their heir. This is further evidence that Abraham may have been grown up within the Hurian culture in northern Mesopotamia. Although, as I said, there were other cultures who had that same provision as this one. It wasn't only the Hurians. But about 14 years after the birth of Ishmael, Sarah gives birth to Isaac. Again, according to the Hurian Nuzi tablets, the son of Sarah, the firstborn wife, now becomes the heir. Because of Ishmael's treatment of Isaac, The Hebrew word sometimes translated as mocking actually indicates violent or sexual behavior, not just mocking. Sarah wants to send Hagar away. But Abraham in Genesis 21:11 is distressed and is reluctant to do so. Why? Again, this is explained by the Nuzi tablets. The tablets state that if the first wife bears a son after the handmaiden has a son, the husband is not allowed to get rid of the handmaiden. This is, in my opinion, the culture Abraham grew up in and why he is reluctant to send Hagar away. However, we read, but God said to him, do not be distressed about the boy and his maidservant. Listen to what Sarah tells you. So wherever the Lord is in control, and he said to Abraham to do what Sarah says. So only then does he send Hagar and Ishmael away. Hagar goes to the desert of Beersheba, which is just to the east of Gerar. This is in accordance with the pattern of God separating and setting apart. So time moves on. Abraham is sitting in his doorway in his tent near Hebron and his three visitors. What he then does is completely in accord with the Near Eastern custom of the day, which was to extend hospitality. Because of the size of his tribe, which must have been very big, we don't actually know how big it was, he was at least the equivalent of a mayor of a town. However, he still bowed low, waited on their every need, and the first thing he did was to bring water to wash and cool their feet. The meal he provided was curds and milk and meat, no vegetables, you may ask. Correct. Abraham, like the Bedouins of more recent times, was a nomad and didn't plant crops, even though later on Isaac, he did plant crops, but Abraham didn't. Now, the Bible
Sorry,
records that
Jim.
around, yeah.
You have a question from Carlos.
Sorry, I'm not looking up there. Yes, yeah, your question?
Good morning, Jim. I just had a question about Hagar, because when you were talking about Hagar, you mentioned she was the maidservant, and I think I had read somewhere that she was possibly one of the Egyptian princesses that had come into his service. Can you tell us a little bit more about Hagar and then her coming into that family, or do you have any more information on that? I'm just interested in finding out who this Hagar character is.
No more information, but I think that's a midrash, isn't it, about what you just said? Not biblical, correct?
Yeah, correct. But I'm just not sure what you probably studied it a lot more than I have.
No, well, I don't know much, but you came from Egypt. I'm pretty sure of that, but I have no further information. But yet she was certainly down the ladder a bit from Sarah, and Sarah certainly put her in her place. Yeah. Okay. Okay. So the Bible records that around the Dead Sea there were tar pits, and also that sulfur rained down on the two cities when they were destroyed, or at least two cities. It is interesting that the first historical event recorded of the Dead Sea indicated the presence of both sulfur and tar. The Nabateans in 312 BCE used to collect floating bitumen. The bitumen would at different times of the year rise up from the bottom of the sea in huge blobs up to 100 meters long. This phenomenon was accompanied by a smell of stinking gas, which tarnished silver and gold, and was presumably hydrogen sulfide, indicating the presence of sulfur. So this gas indicates that even then, about 1,600 years after the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah, there were still sulfur compounds as well as bitumen under the Dead Sea. By the way, the Nabateans wanted it because they sold these bitumen to Egypt, to Cleopatra, and they needed that for their mumming process and for other things too. So that's why they harvested the bitumen at that time. That's another talk there about the Nabateans. Now, Abraham moved on from Hebron, into the region of the Negev and lived between Kadesh and Shur. And for a while he stayed at Gerar. This is quite a bit of traveling, but remember, Abraham is a semi-nomad, and this wandering is a part of his life. He retained his former lifestyle wherever Lot had decided he wanted the decadent city life. what ultimately turned out very badly for him. Well, we don't hear too much more about him, do we, later on, after he was retrieved? Yeah, that's right. So the Wadi Gerar is quite deep and just not far west of, what is it? Oh, golly. Beersheba, yes, I said that. And the adjacent countryside was and is fertile, and today supports lush orchards and large grain fields. In Abraham's day, it was also supported a large population. The episode at Gerar reveals a lot about Abraham. First of all, Abraham assumed that Avimelech was not a God-fearer. And as for the Pharaoh of Egypt, Abraham tells Avimelech that Sarah is his sister, and Avimelech takes Sarah and plans to marry her. But as it turns out, Avimelech and all his officials know about the God of Abraham and fear him with great fear. No doubt, this is because Abraham's reputation had gone before him, together with details about the God he worships. So when Avimelech hears from God that Sarah is Abraham's wife, he returns her together with a lot of sheep, cattle, slaves, and silver. Note here that Avimelech hears from God, but it is not recorded that in the similar instance in Egypt that God spoke to Pharaoh about Sarah. As I said, he could have heard it from Ham. But Avimelech had been afflicted by God, and then Abraham shows that he knows the power of prayer for healing. Abraham prayed to God, and God healed Avimelech, his wife, and his slave girls, so they could have children again. This is the first record of someone praying for healing in the Bible, and interestingly, it was for a Gentile, but to think about it that a bit more, there weren't many Jews around it. They're all Gentiles, basically. I guess it had to be a Gentile. At that time, Avimelech said that. Question. Okay. Oh, is it a question? Oh, sorry. I'm not looking up there.
You're right. Hi, I'm just interested. I know a couple of times you're talking just about Abraham and how it was common in that time and in that culture for him to take the maidservant like he did. Yeah. If we had things in, say, Australian culture that was common for our culture and our time, but was still, I guess, considered not right according to God, would that be justified? And I know Abraham being prior to the giving of the Torah, so there's that added complexity there. But what are your thoughts on a culture and accepting or justifying something because it's an accepted part of that culture in the day?
No, I don't think so. Now that we've got we have the Bible, we have the instructions from not only the Old Testament, we've got Yeshua too. And no, I don't believe it is. Because those who have a Bible, that's it. Yeah. And I don't think it would be good. It's not the right thing to do.
Okay. So would you say he was justified in what he did in taking?
Yeah, I think so. Because he knew basically nothing else. That's what everybody did. And well, it's in some cultures anyway. And yeah, I think so.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay. Okay, he prayed for him as Gentile.
Sorry, Jim.
Yeah, at the time, Avimelech. Oh, yes.
Just want to mention a comment on the chat from Debbie that says, your study needs to be made into a movie about Abraham and the culture. So, doing a good job.
Yeah, it's I found Abraham very interesting. But I enjoy this. What you're hearing now, I enjoy reading it every time. It's a lot of things come out which we don't normally hear about when you just read the scriptures or from other people. Actually, it's only when you dig a little bit deeper into some of these things can you find these things out with an unbiased outlook, by the way, and which is most important. Okay, where are we at the time? Okay, you can read what's on the screen there. That's fine. It's obvious that Abraham is now more powerful than ever. Although Abraham is an alien in Abimelech's country, Abimelech comes to Abraham to request that he does not hurt him in any way. So God had really blessed Abraham at this time. Now we move on to sacrifice of Isaac. The practice of human sacrifice had been carried out throughout history. However, I'm not aware that it was a part of the culture from which Abraham came. And no doubt it was a barbaric act in his eyes. I'm open to correction on that because I don't know. What I've read is it wasn't a part of the normal part of the Mesopotamian culture or the Hurians. However, because of his love for and faith in God, he was prepared to do what God had asked him to do. That sculpture, by the way, was in Jerusalem on the street once for a period of time. It was about 2-3 meters tall. It was quite dramatic. It was outside a shopping centre. The knife Abraham would use would probably have been a flint one, although metal was around at his time. Metal knives then would have been relatively blunt. The Hebrew word for knife is ma'akalet, does not indicate what type of knife. But as a shepherd, though, knowing about the importance of a sharp knife when killing animals, he would want to use a sharp knife, and a flint knife would have been much sharper than a metal one. However, as we know, God dramatically stopped this human sacrifice and provides a substitute sacrifice. So after Sarah died, Abraham went to the owners of Hebron, the Hittites, to seek a burial site. As he did before the Pharaoh of Egypt, Abraham acknowledged to the Hittites that he was a stranger when he approached them. Hittites were a non-Semitic people. Note that the words that Abraham used to describe his state as stranger are similar to the words of God when he said that Abraham's descendants will be strangers in a country not their own for 400 years. Jews generally believe that the 400 years that Abraham's descendants will be strangers in a country not their own commenced with the birth of Isaac, Abraham's first descendant. Therefore, they do not believe that they were in Egypt for 400 years, but 215 years, and I lean in that direction as well. Abraham married Keturah after Sarah died and had 6 sons. But the interesting point is in this scripture on the screen. Abraham left everything he owned to Isaac, but while he was still living, he gave gifts to the sons of his concubines and sent them away from his son Isaac to the land of the east. In this act, Abraham completes the process of ensuring as much as he can that God's promise will come to pass. The land of Canaan was to belong to him and his descendants forever through the line of Isaac. This is what God has said to Abraham immediately following Lot's departure. First of all, Lot separated from him after the destruction of Sodom. Lot's descendants lived east of Canaan in Moab and Ammon. Then Ishmael was separated from Isaac and lived in the desert of Haran, which is in the Sinai. And now Abraham sends up his sons he had from Keturah to the land east of Canaan. At a later date, Isaac's son Esau separates himself to Edom, also east of Canaan. Thus, Canaan is left to the 12 sons of Jacob, the descendants of Abraham and Isaac. After Abraham's death, God blessed his son Isaac, who then lived near Be'er Lahai Roi. A couple of final points. The last time we heard of Ishmael in the scriptures before the death of Abraham was when he and Hagar were sent away when Abraham was about 104 years old. After this, not a single mention of Ishmael was made for over 70 years. But then Ishmael and Isaac come together for Abraham's burial. It's hoped that one day the sons of Isaac, the Jews, will come together with sons of Ishmael, the Arabs. We do know, in fact, that such a time will come. However, there may be a lot more bloodshed before that happens. Secondly, before Abraham dies, he has seen Isaac mature and have 2 sons. Abraham's grandsons in the line of Isaac, Yaakov and Esau, would have been about 15 years old when he died. By then, the two boys would have developed their distinctive characteristics. One studious, the other a hunter. Abraham must have wondered how the God he trusted would increase their number to a multitude like the stars in heaven. However, he trusted, and God, in his good time, fulfilled his promise. No, big slow coming on. Do we have something to learn from Abraham and his faith in the faithfulness of God? Thank you, Pastor Greg.
Well, that was outstanding, Jim. I just I'm not sure if you'll bring. I'm just checking out my screen. There we go. Thanks very much, Dean, for that. Oh, Jim, that was outstanding, and what a wealth of information we've just got then. And isn't it comforting to know that, like that last picture you've shown there? I'm just guessing that was a picture looking down upon the Jewish people at the Western Wall. Was that?
It said that the little capture came up a bit late. We should bring it on more quickly.
Was it?
Yeah, that was looking on the Western Wall with all the Jews praying there.
Yes. Yeah, but isn't this the heart of God and the covenant that he keeps with when he makes a covenant? He makes a covenant with Abraham, and he says, your descendants will occupy this land. It was about the land and his descendants. And we see that now, that even after the latest exile, the children of Israel back in the land, and Abraham's descendants, he must have wondered, because he had one son that God said was going to be the heir. Of course, he had Ishmael and 6 other sons, but one that was destined to be that. And we look at the Jewish people all over the world and those that are in the land at the moment. And I'm sure Abraham is fully aware, wherever he is right now, he's in paradise, looking at that, he can see that God fulfilled that promise, and will so still in a greater way in the days of the Messiah when he comes back. But and the other thing that I think of is when you think of Abraham and his background from paganism, for a man to step out in obedience to God and be a man that trusted in the one true God. He was a monotheistic believer. He believed in one true God and preached that. He was known as a declarer of that. That in itself, I think, is an incredible thing that he believed that. I just still shake my head. Any final... Sorry, Jim.
Sorry. Those Nephilim, or souls he brought out of Haran, they were, according to Jewish teaching, they were a result of his preaching in Haran, how he gathered all those Nephilim around him.
Yeah, there you go. See, that's still, to me, incredible. Any final comments or thoughts from anybody who wants to throw something at Jim today? Pastor Kyle?
I was just going to say, Jim, probably echoing Debbie's thoughts, I feel like this could be broken up probably into a whole series where everything's, because the questions I have so many questions on each different section, but I feel like you've covered so much ground today. And I don't know if Pastor Greg's thinking of maybe doing a longer section series on this or not, but that would be so fantastic. I've loved learning from you today, Jim. Thank you.
I like the questions are fine as long as they're not too theological, because I'm not a theologian. That's not my not like some people. I like the background, the history, the geography.
Well, you know something, I mean, I don't know about everyone else, but and maybe because I immersed myself in the study of this, but that whole idea of the Hurians has really got me, because that explains, doesn't need any explanation. If that's what the culture was that he came from, it makes sense, that he's calling his wife his sister and adopting an heir. Goodness me. And the other thing was the fact that I don't know why I hadn't thought, but Ham was still alive and he was in Egypt. I didn't think of that. Had anyone else thought of that? I don't know. I must have had a little brain freeze there. Anyone else got any final comments there? I'm looking around the room at for those. I can see people taking notes. That's what I noticed. Everyone was just taking reams of notes. You got anything to say, Kel?
Yeah, Oh, sorry. I think like you, it's just these aha moments and more connection to what the verses say. So it brings it alive more, and about Hagar, and then my perspective on what the Ishmael and how possibly the Islamists see stuff, and then what was culture and why he did those things. There's reasons and to it. It's not just happenstance. It wasn't just written because that was just written. There was all this context around it to give it weight. Absolutely. Thanks, Jim. It was great.
Al's got a question or comment, Al?
Just one thought. When God said to the Pharaoh, like he had inadvertently kidnapped Sarah because he didn't know it was Abraham's wife. But God said to Pharaoh, "You are a dead man, for the woman you have taken is Abraham's wife." Now, it's interesting, even though he did that by mistake, but it shows the seriousness of even the Noahide laws to the overall society. So
yeah, great. But like you said, you seem to say that with great delight when you said you are a dead man. Like God saying that you're a dead man, Sarah. Yeah, absolutely. Totally agree. Well, look, Jim, I just want to thank you again on behalf of the Torah portion, and thank you for all the work you do with the International Christian Embassy in Jerusalem, and you and Maxine and the board, and your connections with us, and the festival's just wonderful. And I'm sure we all agree, and thank you for putting all the effort and work into that. And we look forward to hearing from Jim again. We'd like to hear some of the amazing research he's done in many other areas. Actually, he's got about 15 or 16 talks that he does. And so we'd love to try and do that somehow, which we're talking about at the moment. But thank you, Jim. Well, everybody, we'll finish it off a bit early today. The Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make his face shine upon you and be gracious to you. The Lord lift up his countenance upon you and give you his shalom, peace, withholding no good thing. All right, love you all very much. And thank you all for joining us here today. And we'll see you next week on the Torah portion. Shabbat shalom. Bye for now.
Shabbat shalom. Thank
Shalom.
you, Jim.
Thank you.